Okay, we're in Luke chapter 23. We're in the middle of the trial. It's not really a trial, that's not a fair word, but that's what it's called, of Jesus. It's a foregone conclusion what's going to happen. Remember, he's been arrested. He was taken to Annas, who was the power broker of the day in the Jewish world, to his house. And then he was taken to Caiaphas' house, who was the son-in-law of Annas and who was the official high priest. And in both of those places, they tried to establish a case against him. They had witnesses and so on, but the witnesses didn't agree and they were contradictory and so on and so forth. So they had no case. They have no evidence at all that they have no crime with which to accuse this man. They've arrested him, they've beaten him, but they have no crime. And so they don't have anything to go on until, in the very end of chapter 22, Jesus purposefully makes a statement that he knows they will interpret as being blasphemous. He says that he will be sitting on the right hand of God. He's the Son of God, which of course is making himself equal with God. And so that gives the people who are gathered there, Caiaphas and probably some of his cronies, the members of the Sanhedrin who are there, probably not the entire Sanhedrin, parts of it. That gives them an excuse now to kill him. Because he's now, in their own ears, has said, on purpose, voluntarily, he's given them a statement that they can interpret as being a capital crime. And of course they do. However, they can't execute him without running afoul of the Roman authority, Pilate. So in chapter 23, they take him to Pilate's house. But before we go there, this is, from a human perspective, when you look at things that happen historically, this is a minor event. This is a nothing event. It's not even worth recording. The historians of the day didn't even write it down. He didn't even pay any attention because it wasn't worth recording. Pilate was not a very important person. He was the ruler, the governor of a fairly minor province. Judea was not a big, populous, powerful province. It was a pretty minor one. To be the ruler of Judea or in Samaria, to be stationed in Jerusalem as a soldier, as a governor, was not a very good position at all. It's not a job anybody would want. I mean, think about this. You're in Jerusalem with the Jews who hate the Romans. Of course, a lot of people resented the Romans, but the Jews didn't just not like the Romans. As far as they were concerned, all Gentiles were dogs. That's how they refer to them. We have records of that in the Bible. They were dogs. They considered Gentiles to be some sort of subhuman. They were better than the Gentiles. Can you imagine living your life in a group of people that are holier than thou? And that's how they were. They take Jesus to, remember John tells us, they take Jesus to Pilate's courtyard, to Pilate's court to have him tried, and they won't even go inside. They make Pilate come out to them because they're too good to go into a Gentile, whether it's his house or his court. They're too good to go into a Gentile's place because the next day, remember this is the morning of the 14th day of the first month of the Jewish calendar. The next day, the 15th, is the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and it's a Sabbath. And if they went into the Gentiles' courtroom, they would be polluting themselves and be ceremonially unclean and unable to participate in the festivities on the Sabbath day. So they won't even go in. Now, can you imagine that? They take this guy that they want executed, and they take him to Pilate to get him to execute, and they won't even go into his courtroom because it will make them polluted. Can you imagine trying to live in that kind of environment? And Pilate says, "Why are you here?" This is in John, and they say, "This is a criminal." And Pilate says, "Well, what has he done?" Perfectly legitimate question. You know what their answer was? Their answer was, "Well, if he wasn't a criminal, we wouldn't have brought him to you." Like, what kind of I don't know how that would translate in first century Jerusalem, but in our day, that's just smart aleck. So this is who Pilate's trying to deal with. So this is not a good job he's got. And he's a very minor person. He's apparently from a wealthy family. That's probably how he got his job back, and he's from Italy. He was appointed as governor of Jerusalem in about AD 26, and he served for about 10 years. And there are a few records that mention him, but he was not considered anything important. He was just sort of a minor governmental function, bureaucrat. If it hadn't been for his involvement with Jesus, nobody would have heard of him. He was the fifth such governor of Judea and Samaria. Name the other four. Yeah, you've never heard of him. Neither have I. You can look it up, I suppose, but there are records somewhere. But, so he was not an important person. And then this act, that's what's going on here with this Jewish guy that's on trial, he's just another false Messiah. They know he's a false Messiah because he died, and the Messiah was supposed to live forever, and he's died. And there were many, many people who claimed to be Messiahs who weren't. And so if you were a Jew and this happens, as far as you know, this is another false Messiah who runs afoul of the Romans and pays for his life with it. And that's it. It's not even worth writing down. It's not even, it's just a commonplace event. It's nothing really very important. And nobody did write it down. We have no records. We have very few, if any records of Pilate. We have very few records of anything happening because it just wasn't, from a human perspective, it was an insignificant event. What was going on here. Now, again, we know, because God has told us, that this crucifixion and his resurrection were the most important things that have ever happened on this planet. The only other events that come even close to that would be the fall, back in Genesis chapter 3. And of course, without the fall, none of this would have been necessary, but this is the most important thing that ever happened. Far outshadows any other historical event you can think of. It's the climax of history. Everything before it points toward this day when Jesus is going to die, and then a few days later when he comes back to life. And everything after that is just tying up loose ends and gathering in people like us, the lost sheep. So this is the most important thing that's ever happened in the history of the planet. But from a human perspective, it's not even worth recording. It's a nothing event. Pilate's just a minor official, and this man that's being crucified is just another Jew that ran afoul of the Romans, and it's over. Now, I think, remember, his life qualified him to die for the atonement. The resurrection validated his death and demonstrated that his death was sufficient to atone for the sins of all those that would believe. However, remember, after his resurrection, the only people he goes to are those who already believe. He didn't go back to Pilate and say, hey, look, here I am. He didn't go to Caiaphas or Annas or the Sanhedrin or even the general public. He only went to those who already believed. So if you're in a position of authority in Jerusalem at the time, it's easy to dismiss this rumor of this man coming back to life as nothing more than a rumor. Because what kind of idiot is going to believe that somebody comes back to life? That never happens. Nobody, and there was no evidence except for these few fanatics. There's no evidence that it actually happened, so it's easy to dismiss that. And remember, the only people who witnessed the resurrection, and I don't know what they saw or heard or felt, were those soldiers that were guarding the tomb. And all the Bible tells us about them is that they fell down as dead. And then when they woke up, they went to the chief priest and told the chief priest what had happened. And the chief priest, whatever they had to say, whatever those soldiers had to say was significant enough that the chief priest paid them large money, much money, to shut them up. And they covered up this event completely. And to this day, nobody knows what those soldiers saw, heard, or felt. The Bible doesn't record it. We have any idea. So there was no real evidence that Jesus was resurrected, unless you were already a believer, in which case you saw him with your own eyes and you saw the holes in his hands and where the spear had pierced his side and all, you saw him. But if you weren't one of those few believers, there was no real evidence this ever happened. And that's true to this day. But now look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Okay, let's see. I will start in verse 17. For Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel. Of course, Paul is writing to the church in Corinth. Not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ be made of none effect. For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us which are saved it is the power of God. For it is written, this is he's quoting now, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and I will bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this word? Where are the learned people of this word? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For after that, in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom, its wisdom, knew not God. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. For the Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. We preach the Messiah died. That's what Paul says. That's what I preach. That's what Paul said. I preach the Messiah died, which to the Jews is a stumbling block, because the Messiah wasn't supposed to die. He was to live forever. And to the Greeks is foolishness. Who cares? Paul makes it clear that the wisdom of God puts to shame, makes foolishness out of the wisdom of men. And in men's wisdom, these events that are described in the Gospels are just, everyday, run-of-the-mill, nothing special, no point in even worrying about, no point in even recording them, writing them down, because they're just ordinary, nothing to them. They're nothing. But in God's wisdom, they're the most important things that ever happened. And so we get to Pilate now, and here's Pilate, who's a relatively minor Roman official. He was appointed, he was ruler of Judea for about 10 years. He was from a wealthy family in Italy, which is probably how he got his job. People that are historians say that this whole narrative of Pilate and Jesus and the Jews at this time is out of character for Pilate. Because as you read the Gospels, you see Pilate was reluctant to condemn this man. He was reluctant to execute this man. He didn't really want to. His hand was forced, so to speak. Which people that study history say this is out of character for this guy, because this guy had a reputation of being violent and vicious. In fact, in AD 36, roughly 3 years after this event, he was deposed because he, for some reason or other, executed a bunch of Samaritans. I don't know how many a bunch is, and I don't know why. I don't find any information about that, but it was an egregious enough act that his boss, his direct supervisor, who was in Syria, had him deposed, told the emperor to get rid of this guy, and they did. What happened to Pilate after that, nobody knows. Some people, there are records that go back to the 1st and 2nd century that say that he committed suicide in disgrace. There are others that say he retired peacefully to his family's, property, and others say he was exiled to France. So nobody knows what happened to him. He was not a very important person. But this is out of character. He is, as you can see, he's reluctant to do this. Very reluctant. So we get into verse 2 of chapter 23 of Luke. And they began to accuse Jesus, saying, "We found this fellow perverting the nation, forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ the King." And Pilate asked him, saying, "Art thou the King of the Jews?" And he answered him, said, "Thou sayest." Now notice, this whole thing now. The accusations that were brought were criminal, capital offenses. To set yourself up as a king in opposition to Caesar was treason and was going to be treated as such. And there are many records of people who were treated exactly, who did that and were treated accordingly. So these are serious accusations. Remember, through this whole thing, Jesus is never pleading for mercy. He's never saying he's innocent. He's never poking holes in the arguments presented as his trials. He's never proclaiming innocence. He's doing nothing, which is entirely, the people who were judging him, I'm sure they had never seen such a thing before. Here's a man who ought to be fighting for his life, and he's not. He's not doing anything. He doesn't say hardly anything. And when he does say something, it tends to be condemning. He doesn't do anything. He's not protesting. He's not resisting when they're beating him and so on. He's not pleading for mercy. He's not begging them to stop. He's not doing anything. He's not retaliating. He's doing nothing. This is probably unique in these people's experience. I mean, consider, if you were being falsely accused of a capital crime and you were facing the horrible death of crucifixion, would you not protest? Would you not try to save yourself? Would you not try to do something? And Jesus is doing nothing. He's completely in control of the situation because, after all, he was the one who volunteered the information that allowed the Sanhedrin and Caiaphas to say he's guilty of blasphemy. That came out of his own mouth. They didn't have any witnesses. He said that on purpose. So Pilate is interrogating him and says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered and said, "Thou sayest it." Now, in one of the other Gospels, Jesus responds and says, are you saying this yourself, or is this what somebody told you? thou sayest. Now think about that. If you say that, what you're saying is, do you have evidence that I'm king of the Jews? Or are you just believing what somebody else told you? That's what he's saying. Is there any evidence? And of course, Pilate doesn't have any evidence. So Pilate, he says, thou say, verse 4, then said Pilate to the chief priests and to the people, I find no fault in this man. You told me he was a criminal. You brought me to, I asked him what he had done. He said, we wouldn't have brought you to me. We wouldn't have brought him to you if he wasn't a criminal. But what has he done? I can't find anything. I don't have any evidence of he's ever done anything. And they, verse 4, were the more fierce, saying, he stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place. When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And of course he was. He's from Nazareth. And as soon as he heard that he belonged in Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem at the time. Now Herod, remember, this is Herod. This is not the Herod that was king when Jesus was born. This is his son. Herod Antipas is what he's called. And he was the ruler he was called a tetrarch, which means he's a ruler of a quarter. He was the ruler of Galilee and another province called Perea, which was on the east side of the Jordan River. And of course, Galilee was almost entirely Jewish, and Perea was not. He was the son of Herod the Great. This is the Herod who had John beheaded. This is the Herod who married his brother's wife, Herodotus, and who John criticized and got beheaded for it. So this is that man. He's lived in Palestine. He's not a Jew. His father was an Edomite, descendant of Esau, apparently. And he was not a Jew, but he'd lived in Jewish territory most of his life. He was educated in Rome, but he lived in Jewish territory. So he understood much more about the Jews than Pilate did. To Pilate, this was a total mystery. Who are these people, and where in the world they get these crazy ideas? That kind of stuff. But Herod understood. In fact, Herod, according to historians, talked Pilate out of some really stupid moves at some point in the past that had to do with symbolism of Rome and so on. But Herod knew more. He was not a Jew, but he knew a lot more about the Jews than Pilate did. And so Pilate had probably never heard of Jesus. Jesus hasn't spent much time in Jerusalem. Pilate spends most of his time in Caesarea, according to historians, because Caesarea is a Roman city. He only came to Jerusalem when he had to, more or less, because Jerusalem was a Jewish city and it wasn't comfortable there probably. So Pilate probably had no idea who this man was. But we get to Herod now, and he sends him to Herod. Again, Pilate's trying to pass this thing off. He doesn't want to deal with this. So in verse 8, when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad. He'd heard of this man. This man lived most of his life in Galilee, and most of his ministry, his works were in Galilee. So Herod sees this guy, and he's delighted. Why is he delighted? Well, look at the next phrase. For he was desirous to see him of a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. So Herod's heard of this guy. He knows him. He's heard he does miracles. And he wants to see one. And here comes Jesus. He's probably all bloody and beaten by now. But here comes Jesus, a gift from Pilate. And Herod's like, oh boy, I'm going to get to see, I want to see the magic show, is what he wants. And of course, Jesus does not comply. Nothing happens. In verse 9, then he questioned him with many words. Fires questions. He's trying to get Jesus to perform a miracle because he wants to see one of these legendary miracles that he's heard this man can produce. But he answered him nothing. That's verse 9. Jesus doesn't say a thing. He just stands there. Herod asks him question after question after question, says many questions. Jesus doesn't respond at all. He doesn't do any miracles. He doesn't do anything. Well, Herod is probably, shall we say, disappointed at least, because he was all excited about seeing him and then nothing happened. In verse 10, and the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. So here's Jesus standing in front of Herod. Herod is anxious to see a miracle. That's what he wants to see, is a miracle. And Jesus is standing there. Herod's asking him all these questions. Jesus is not responding. Over here, the chief priests and Pharisees are over, I don't want to point at anybody. Over here is these chief priests and Pharisees, and they're just going bananas, firing accusation after accusation after accusation, just trying to incense Herod. But nothing happens. And then it says that in verse 11, and Herod and his men set him, men of war, that's his soldiers, or on his command, set him at naught and mocked him, and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe. They put a purple robe on him. It tells us in other Gospels. A purple, of course, was a color that was very rare and hard to come by. expensive, and it was reserved for royalty and so on. At times it was reserved only for the emperor, but at other times it was expended to other people who were. So they're making fun of him, king of the Jews, this sort of stuff. Now remember, Herod considers himself a king of the Jews because he's the ruler of, even though he hasn't got the title of king, he's the ruler of Galilee, which is Judean. And here's this man who is supposedly in competition with him for king, but of course he's a helpless criminal in court, and of course they're making fun of him. And his soldiers have a good, and again, just like the soldiers previously, they have a good time beating up on this guy and making fun of him. It's just fun, because he's such an idiot, because he claims to be the king, and he's clearly not a king. He's clearly just another criminal. And so Herod sends him back to Pilate. Because even though he is a Galilean, the historians say that the Roman law was that you got tried in the place where you committed the crime. He was accused of the crime in Jerusalem. It's like, if someone commits a crime in Arkansas and they get arrested in Illinois, they send them back to Arkansas for trial. Same kind of idea. So he sends him back to Pilate, so Herod has nothing to do with it. But it also adds this thing that says that the same day, verse 12, same day Pilate and Herod were made friends together. For before they were in enmity between themselves. Herod had tried to correct Pilate. Pilate had done some things, on several occasions tried to do things that Herod knew would infuriate the Jews unnecessarily, and he tried to talk Pilate off the edge of that cliff, and a couple times at least, according to historians, had been successful, and so that probably created some friction between them. But this, their willingness to deal with Jesus, now they're friends. 13, and Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests and the rulers of the people, he said unto them, Ye have brought this man unto me as one that perverteth the people, and behold, I have examined him before you in your presence, having found no fault in this man touching the things whereof you accuse him. Meaning, you don't have any evidence. All I have is your word. I don't have his word because he won't say anything. All I have is your accusations. You haven't presented me any evidence that this man has done anything, let alone anything worthy of death. That's what he's saying. Again, Pilate is reluctant to deal with this issue. Why was he reluctant? As some people say, it's out of character. We don't really know. We do know that they accused him of being the Son of God. Now, in Pilate's world, in the Greek Roman mythology, there were such things as sons of the gods and goddesses. Hercules, for example, was a legendary son of Zeus, I believe it was, if I got my mythology right. So this was not a foreign concept to Pilate, that this man really could be the offspring of one of the gods. I don't know how devout Pilate was or what he believed. That's a possibility. We also know that his wife had a dream and told him, don't have anything to do with this guy. Now, put those two things together in the world that Pilate lived in, and it's very likely that he thought that this man might really be an offspring of one of the gods or goddesses, and that his wife had gotten a message from the god not to deal with this guy. And so Pilate may have been afraid of incurring the wrath of one of his gods or goddesses by dealing with this guy. I don't know, but whatever reason, he's reluctant. So he says, you brought to me, but there's nothing here. You don't have any evidence. And then he says in verse 15, nor yet Herod, for I sent you to him, and to him, and two, nothing worthy of death is done unto him. So Herod didn't find any evidence either. So you've got this guy before me, and you want me to punish him, but he hasn't done anything. You haven't got any evidence. In verse 16, I will therefore chastise him, which probably means I'm going to whip him, and release him. That was Pilate's conclusion. You brought this guy, you say he's a criminal, you don't have any evidence, I can't find anything against him, and so what I'll do is I'll just whip him and I'll let him go. And that should be sufficient to calm down the mob. And then Luke inserts this thing that says, in verse 17, for of necessity was released unto them at the feast. Apparently there was some kind of custom where Pilate would release a prisoner. And remember, many of the prisoners Pilate took were prisoners because they were Jews. They were political prisoners. They weren't necessarily criminals. And so it was apparently customary that he would release one of these political prisoners that the Jews wanted released, as an appeasement at the time of the feast. Although, again, the only record of that's in the Bible. Nobody else thought that was important enough to write down. And they cried out at one voice, saying, away with this man, and release unto us Barabbas. Now, who was Barabbas? Well, the answer is nobody knows. He wasn't important enough to write down, so nobody knows who he was. What the Gospels tell us is that, verse 19, for all the Gospels repeat something of this nature, who for a certain sedition made in the city and for murder was cast into prison. So this man had tried to lead some kind of insurrection, sedition. And the other Gospels agree with that, some sort of insurrection. And in the process of doing that, some people got murdered. So this man was someone who really had led some sort of minor insurrection against Rome. It wasn't big enough to even write it down, so we don't know what happened, but he did something. So this man is a real criminal. He's not only is he a murderer of some sort, but he's also a traitor to Rome. And this is who they want. Pilate, therefore, willing to release Jesus, spake again unto them. And they cried, saying, crucify him, crucify him. At this point now, it's a mob. To some extent it always was, but now it's a mob of people. Pilate's there by himself saying, this man hasn't done anything. And there's a mob out there yelling for this man's blood. They want him crucified. They want him subjected to the most horrible death that the Romans allowed. So they wanted him crucified. Verse 22, and he said to them a third time, why? What evil has he done? I find no cause of death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. Now, the other Gospels tell us that he gave them a choice and they picked Barabbas. Now, you see the choice he's giving them with Barabbas. What he's really saying is, are y'all friends of Rome? Because here's a man that you say is the king of the Jews, that you say is inciting people to revolt against Rome, but I can't find any evidence of that at all. As a Roman whose job it is to protect the empire, I can't find anything this man has ever done. You have no evidence that any of these things are true. I can't find any fault in him. I can't find anything that says to me he's leading a rebellion or he's going to lead a rebellion. He hasn't got any supporters. He hasn't got any money. He's all alone. He won't even answer my questions. I can't find anything. Now, on the other hand, here's this Barabbas guy that has led some sort of revolt. Obviously, it wasn't very successful, but has led some sort of revolt, and people have died as a result of that. As friends of Rome, would you rather that I release to you this man who actually has revolted against Rome, or this man that you say is going to revolt against Rome, but I can't find any evidence of that, and I'm a Roman, it's my job. That's the choice he's giving them, and that's apparent in the other Gospels. And they say we want Barabbas. We want the guy who actually is a murderer, who actually has tried to lead some kind of unsuccessful revolt. That's the guy we want. So in verse 22, again, what evil has he done? I find no cause of death in him. I'll therefore chastise him and let him go. And they were instant with loud voices, requiring that he might be crucified, and the voices of them and of the chief priests prevailed. Pilate's got a mob on his hands. Remember, Pilate's primary job as the Roman governor of Judea is to keep the peace. And the Jews didn't want to keep peace. They were all the time agitating. They were all the time, and they were not above sending delegates to the emperor. They'd done it before. Remember, we talked about Herod's son, who was ruler of Judea before Romans took it over. And they sent a delegation to Rome saying, we won't have this man rule over us. And the emperor listened. So Pilate knows these people are not above sending delegation to the emperor himself and getting me in trouble. They've done it before, and they can probably do it again. And here there's this mob out here demanding that I crucify this guy. This guy's a nobody. He hasn't got any, who am I going to offend by crucifying this guy? Well, nobody. Nobody's support. He hasn't got any supporters. He hasn't got any money. He hasn't got any wealthy people on his side. He hasn't got any powerful people behind him. He's got nothing. He's just I don't know what this is all about or why they want him dead, but I can't find any reason for it. But hey, it's better to crucify this guy than it is to have to deal with this mob out here. And there's no telling what they might do. And if they go crazy, and they're about to, I'm going to have to answer for that. And so, verse 24, and Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they required. Pilate was pressured into condemning Jesus to crucifixion. He could have resisted. He had the authority to resist. He had the soldiers to enforce his decision, but it was obviously much more politically expedient for him to agree to crucify Christ than it was to let him go. And so he agrees. And in verse 25, and they released unto them And he released unto them him that for sedition and murder was cast into prison, whom they had desired, and he delivered Jesus to their will. Pilate gives in. He gives in. And you can understand why he did. He didn't want to have a mob riot in the city of Jerusalem and have to answer to that to the Roman authorities that were his superiors, and it was far easier for him to give in and have this nobody crucified than it was to have to deal with a mob, a riot in his city. And so he gives in. And he gives Jesus over to the soldiers for crucifixion. There was a centurion in charge of the execution duty. And as you know from other Gospels, the soldiers beat him, and Pilate also had him whipped, had him scourged. So by the time we get to this point, Jesus has been beaten up at least 2 or 3 times. He's been whipped. He's been mocked and made fun of. And he has done nothing. I don't mean just that he has committed no crime. Remember, the crime he's committed, according to the Sanhedrin, is one that he gave them. He gave them the words they needed on purpose. But he's not resisted. He's not pled for mercy. He's not asked, he's not proclaimed his innocence. He's not defended himself. He's not defended himself physically when they were beating him up, and he's not defended himself verbally when he's in front of these people that have the right, have the authority to have him executed. He's done nothing. Again, he's there because he wants to be there. He's there because this is the goal of his life. This is why he came. This is why he went through all the things he went through, so he could be there, and he's not about to in any way resist it. In fact, in a sense, he's directing the whole proceedings. But now he is in the hands of the mob. One last thing and we'll close. And as they led him away, they laid upon one Simon, a Cyrenian, coming out of the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. Remember, the custom was that the condemned criminal that was going to be crucified had to carry their cross to the site of crucifixion. So they were carrying the implement of their own torture to the place they were going to be crucified. Jesus was too weak. He couldn't carry it. Now, I know remember, we've sanitized this. We think of crosses as these big, tall, sort of, if you've ever been to Effingham, Illinois, there's this huge, gigantic, 100-foot crosses out there. But that's probably not what it looked like. It may have been a T-shaped thing like that, but it may have also been an X. And it would have been something that they used over and over again. And it would have been, now think about this, it would have been light enough that a man could carry it. The size of some of the crosses, there's no way one person could carry those. This is a man who's on his way to being crucified who would carry his own cross. So this was not some kind of, in any way, any kind of spectacular, glorious spectacle. This was as low as you can get. This cross was probably bloodstained and had been used repeatedly and was, filthy and just big enough to get the man's feet off the ground. And it was nothing at all. We think of 3 crosses on a hill, probably nothing like that. And then again, remember, Jesus told people to be willing to take up their cross and follow him. And we've sanitized that into, well, that means you endure some kind of hardship. No, that's not the image Jesus was using when he said, take up your cross and follow me. He was using this image of a condemned criminal carrying on his own back the cross on which he was going to be tortured to death. That's what Jesus was talking about when he said, take up your cross. And that's what the people who listened to him would have understood, because they knew about crucifixions and they knew about the custom of the Romans where you carried your own cross. So when he said, take up your cross and follow me, he's talking about this. He's talking about being willing, you follow me to the point of torturous death. That's what he's saying. If you're not willing to follow me all the way there, then you're not willing to follow me. You're not really following me. You're here for something else. And we know that there were very few people who were willing to follow him all the way to the cross. So that's the imagery he's using. So he's struggling through the streets. He probably can barely walk. He's struggling through the streets. Here's this man that they just shanghaied out of the audience, because by this time there's a crowd gathered. Now at this point in time, it's maybe 10 o'clock in the morning, something like that. Most of this was done at early in the morning, before anybody even knew what was happening. The only people who knew what was happening were the chief priests and that group, and they undoubtedly, I mean, think about it. Here you come to the temple or to the area near Pilate's court, which may have been right next to the temple. We're not quite sure where he was, but he might have been in the guardhouse that was adjoining the temple. That's very likely, actually. And you're just going about your business, and here's this big crowd over here. And they're yelling. And it's a big commotion. You don't know what's going on. You go over there to see, and there's a man up there. You can't even recognize him. You don't know who he is. And they're going, crucify him, crucify him. And the chief priests and so on, who are the leaders of the people, are cheerleading this group to get him to yell for crucifixion. So there were probably a lot of people that just joined in because that's what the chief priests were doing. They didn't know what was going on. They didn't know who this man was. They didn't know what was happening at all. They just heard this big mob, and so they joined in. They're yelling at Pilate, who everybody hated because he was a cruel Roman, and so they're just yelling along with him, and that's what happened. And so he ends up on his way to the place where he's going to be crucified. And he couldn't even carry his own cross. And remember, the cross would have been light enough that a man could carry it. If you've ever held lumber around, you know it doesn't take a whole lot. He couldn't carry it, so they shanghaied this guy out of the audience to carry it for him. He's struggling through the streets. He's gone probably from the location near the temple up to wherever Golgotha was. We don't know, nobody knows for sure where it was. There's a traditional place, but nobody knows if that's really where it was or not, because if you think about it, this is a big city and geography changes and hills get leveled and all this kind of stuff. So nobody knows exactly where it was. But it's over. Any chance of him not being crucified is now over. But again, it's exactly what he wanted. That was exactly what he wanted. That is exactly the goal of everything he's done in his entire life, was to reach this goal. And in the trials, so-called trials, he made sure that it happened. Well, we'll stop there and we'll pick up next week. Father, this is horrible. The worst thing that we as a race have ever done, and it was done because of people like me. It was done, it was necessary in your wisdom. It was necessary for the atonement of the sins of people like me. Father, it's beyond our comprehension. It's obvious that you were completely in charge, that you were doing this willingly. It was because it needed to be done, because you wanted it to be done, because the glory that was to come was far greater than the price that was paid. And Father, we are, in some sense, that glory. Father, we ask you to give us wisdom, and to give us strength, and give us courage. We know that you'll supply our needs. We know that you will give us good things. We ask, Father, that you might enable us to live, your Spirit to live through us. We might, in some small sense, reflect your glory to ourselves, to those in this building, to those around us, as you see fit. We thank you, Lord, that you accomplish your purpose. We thank you that you will do your will. And we ask, Father, that you would cause us to willingly submit to it, whatever it might be. In Jesus' name, amen.